We're glad to have Jay here with us. He's the executive director with Common Cause Wisconsin. And we can kick off the call by Jay, you may be giving us a little bit of background on your role so far and where you've been and where you're going, and what you've done with the gerrymandering so far in Wisconsin, and then we can dive right in.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be with you. I had an opportunity to chat with Janelle briefly last week, and then also had an opportunity to look at your own website and some of the work that you've been doing. And I can tell you, I mean, I've been the director of Common Cause Wisconsin for 25 years. I worked in the legislature before that. I worked for a member of Congress. But I would say that of all the, really almost of any of the organizations that I've seen in terms of the work and the things that you've been doing, I mean, I'm just very impressed with what you have accomplished in your, what is it, 7 or 8 counties in western Wisconsin along the Mississippi River, and then really kind of your grasp of the issue and your organization. It really demonstrates to me that the kind of grassroots work that you're doing is really the heart of this issue, and why I am confident that we are eventually going to do this. But the obstacles in Wisconsin are considerable and great, and I think one of the things that you need to be fully cognizant of are some of the landmines that lay ahead of us, as well as some of the things that other states are able to do that we're not able to do in Wisconsin because of not just political considerations, but because of constitutional matters. So I guess, I mean, I'm a pragmatist, a realist, but I'm also an optimist, because I do see so much greater support and so much greater citizen involvement in this issue than when we first accompanied this, or we first started this really 20 years ago, but really in earnest in 2011. And just let me begin by saying that, 2011 really marks the first time that Wisconsin has had a serious redistricting issue, because in the 5 prior redistricting processes dating back to 1950, we have always had split government in the state, which means to say that we've always had a governor and a legislature of a different political party, which meant that after the census and when it came time to drawing the political maps, there always had to be, because of split government, a compromise. There had to be Republicans and Democrats actually sort of splitting the difference and then agreeing to drawing state legislative and congressional maps, because that's how power was split in Wisconsin. And so the maps were never tremendously controversial. They always went to a federal court for adjusting, to make sure that they were in compliance with the Voting Rights Act and with civil rights laws. But there was never a partisan gerrymandering such that we saw in 2011. And of course, you all understand the reason that happened in 2011 was because the Republicans, for the first time during a redistricting process, controlled all the levers of power. And so there was nothing to stop them other than their consciences and a belief in good government and a belief in voters being able to have a choice. But of course, there was nothing to stop them from just doing whatever they wanted. And Wisconsin was not unique. There were a number of states in the country that did the same thing in 2011. It was a national strategic Republican effort to do this. It happened in my native state of Ohio. It happened in Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, a number of other states. And of course, there were some Democratic gerrymanders equally as onerous. Certainly Maryland, Rhode Island, and for the last 50 years, our neighbors to the south, Illinois, have had just as vicious and partisan a gerrymander, keeping Republicans out of the possibility of having any power as the Republicans did here in Wisconsin to the Democrats. So this is not a political party Republican thing. This is a power thing. So with that, the reason that and I want this to be a conversation, because I think it's not like you need to understand the reasons for gerrymandering. I mean, you're all committed to it, and you obviously have done a lot of work on this. But I think it's probably useful for you to know why the Iowa model in particular is the one that reformers have united behind in Wisconsin, and what all that involves at this point in time, and what it's going to involve in the immediate future. And really the quick way to explain that is that that reformers really united behind Iowa beginning about 8 or 9 years ago. There are other models for redistricting. California, as you know, has a citizens panel, which consists of citizens that are appointed to a panel, and the legislature is completely kept out of the process. The citizens draw the maps, and then the maps are submitted to the people, and the people vote on them. And so the legislature is bypassed completely in California. Well, California, and there are a number of other states that can do that too. Michigan is one that is able to bypass the legislature. There's a number of other states, roughly half, 25 states, 26 states have initiative and referendum. Wisconsin does not. We do not have the ability to bypass the legislature. And there's an interesting story about why that is the case. It was actually the progressives that put that into place, believing in the 1920s they would always be in power and didn't want their work to ever be overthrown by an ignorant majority. That I'm being a little facetious, but it is true that that was a progressive thing that happened back in the 1920s to prevent initiative and referendum in Wisconsin. But nevertheless, that is the system that we have in place. And so when you're looking at the redistricting process, you have to be practical about what you can do. So we can't set up a citizens panel. We have to go through the legislature, because the Wisconsin Constitution stipulates that the legislature shall determine the maps every 10 years after the census. Now, this is why we chose Iowa, because Iowa also has that same provision. They don't have initiative and referendum. They also have a provision in their constitution that says the legislature shall determine who shall draw the maps. But the difference between Iowa and, say, California and others is that in Iowa, they have a process by which a nonpartisan entity called the Legislative Service Bureau draws the maps according to a very strict set of nonpartisan criteria. And the criteria is very simple and straightforward. Things like squares and rectangles are good. Things like keeping counties together to the extent possible, keeping communities of interest and cities together to the extent possible, not taking into consideration the past political performance of a district, not looking at the election results when the maps are being drawn, not even taking into consideration the hometowns of the state legislators or members of Congress. So these are simple, straightforward, common sense criteria that are used by the Iowa Legislative Service Bureau, and the legislature is not involved in the drawing of the maps. The legislature must approve the maps, and they must be approved, though, only by an up or down vote of the Iowa legislature. There's no amendments. The legislature can't interfere in the maps. They can't amend them. They can't say, this is the way we want the maps being drawn. They're drawn by this nonpartisan entity, and then they're submitted to the legislature for up or down votes. And that has been the system in Iowa since 1980. It was put in place, and this is something that you should know and you should spout, it was put into place by a Republican-controlled legislature and a Republican governor, Governor Robert Ray, in 1980. And it was done because the Republicans wanted to save taxpayer dollars because the maps had been involved in litigation before the 1980 census, and it was costing taxpayers money to litigate these maps. And Republicans back then used to be very frugal about spending taxpayer money. Certainly in Iowa they were. They're not in Wisconsin, I can tell you, if you look at what the Republicans have been willing to spend to protect their partisan maps here in Wisconsin. So the idea, this was a Republican initiative, and the Iowa system was put into place, and it has been in place since the 1980 census. So that's 4 redistricting processes. And everybody in Iowa has bought into it, from the most liberal Democrats like former United States Senator Tom Harkin, who was about as progressive a United States Senator that has ever served, to, and this will shock you, the very conservative, and now on his way out, I'm happy to say, Republican Congressman Stephen King of Northwest Iowa, who is an extremely conservative Republican. But all Republicans and Democrats have bought into the Iowa system because it is so firmly entrenched, and the people of Iowa so strongly support it, that any legislator of either party that tries to mess with it would really suffer a tremendous embarrassment, and I think a political detrimental problem if they tried to dispute having the Legislative Service Bureau of Iowa draw the maps. And so in 40 years in Iowa, it has never been rejected by the Iowa legislature. It has come to up and down votes in the Iowa legislature. Only once has it ever gone past the first vote. And what happens in Iowa is there's 3 tries. If after the first vote, it's voted down by the legislature, then the Legislative Service Bureau makes some adjustments and they put forward other maps. Again, the Republicans and the Democrats don't weigh in with their amendments. They just say, we don't like those maps, and adjustments are made. And then after the second time in Iowa, if they are not passed by both houses of the legislature, then in Iowa, the partisans are allowed to come in and have free reign. Now, that has never happened in Iowa because the legislature, the legislature has never dared to dispute the Legislative Service Bureau and risk the wrath of the voters of Iowa. It's a little different in Wisconsin, and so we do have a different provision in our law, because we know very well that Robin Vos and Scott Fitzgerald, who are the Republican leaders of the Wisconsin legislature, would have no problem whatsoever waiting it out through 2 votes of the Wisconsin legislature if they had the opportunity on the third go around to go in there and they'd be able to draw their own maps and then ram them through. So we have in the Iowa legislation, model legislation in Wisconsin, a provision that says if after 2 iterations, it does not pass the Wisconsin legislature, the unamended maps that are drawn by the Legislative Reference Bureau, then they could be drawn by the partisan leaders, but in order to pass, it would require 3/4 of the votes in each house of the legislature. So essentially that's a safety valve to prevent the partisan maps from being rammed through the Wisconsin legislature as they could be in Iowa. In Iowa, it would only require a majority, but they have the culture in place that the legislature in the Iowa wouldn't dare dispute the Legislative Service Bureau there. We don't think that Vos and Fitzgerald have that in their mind. They would be more than happy to ram through their own maps if the maps that were drawn by the nonpartisan Legislative Reference Bureau didn't pass for the first 2 times, and they held all their members to make sure that they didn't pass so that they could ram through their own maps. So that's the safety valve that we had to put in place in the Wisconsin version of the Iowa legislation that all of the groups support. And by the way, As you know, the Wisconsin legislation that was introduced this past year in 2019, Assembly Bill 303 and Senate Bill 288, that legislation has the support of five Republican co-sponsors in the Wisconsin Assembly, including members from Western Wisconsin. And I would argue that that's in large part because of the work of people like you, and also because of the fact that there have been counties in Western Wisconsin that have passed referendums that have said, the people in those counties say they have supported nonpartisan redistricting reform. Another thing to keep in mind in Wisconsin, these county referendums are extremely important because they demonstrate popular support for nonpartisan redistricting reform, but they're not binding. Unlike other states that have binding initiative and referendums in Wisconsin at the county level and even at the statewide level are only advisory. They are not required, the legislature isn't required to do what the people of those counties think should be done. They can say, well, that's all very interesting, what people in St. Croix and Viroqua and La Crosse County and all those folks have said, but we don't necessarily have to do that. But what they are important for doing is putting pressure on local legislators, particularly Republican legislators, who have been reluctant to support nonpartisan redistricting reform. And I can tell you that one of the reasons why Lauren Oldenburg, who is from Viroqua, or Joel Kitchens, who is from Door County in northeastern Wisconsin, and a couple of other members, Travis Tranel, who's from Cuba City in southwestern Wisconsin. These are Republican state representatives who support the Iowa model. And one of the reasons is because of the pressure put on by citizens like you for support of a nonpartisan system. And so that is incredibly important. And that work will be incredibly important this fall when, as you know, there are 9 county referendums, advisory referendums granted, but still referendums where citizens will be able to vote and weigh in on these referendums in support of the Iowa system and in support of nonpartisan redistricting reform. And let me just finish with this. Every county that has had such a referendum, and there have been 17 thus far, before the 9 that we're going to see this fall in November, every time it's been on the ballot, it's not only passed overwhelmingly, but by at least 70%. This is not a Republican or Democratic issue. Republicans support this as well as Democrats. It's not as if Republicans are like, oh yeah, we support Fitzgerald and Voss on this issue. We like partisan gerrymandering because it keeps the Republicans in control. Republican voters don't like it because they know that elections that have their own state representatives who don't have to fear an election makes those people less responsive to the wants and needs of even the Republicans in the district. And that's simply because if you live in a safe district, you don't have to listen to your constituents because you know you have a safe district and you can do almost anything. And the reason we know this is that a number of Republican legislators have said as much. State Senator Leah Vukmir, who ran for the United States Senate in 2018 against Tammy Baldwin, said very frankly one time, I don't have to listen to people who disagree with me because I have a safe Republican district in the Milwaukee suburbs and I can do what I want. And that is just very telling. And so that is why voters who are Republican as well as Democratic voters loathe and hate this partisan process that we have in Wisconsin. And again, why I'm pretty confident that eventually we're going to be able to overturn it. Now, I want to open this up to you for questions and for conversation, but I do want to also take a little time as we go on to point what we see happening next year in the legislature with regard to what's going to happen with fair maps legislation and then with the redistricting process, how it's likely to turn out. And then also talk a little bit about how the courts are going to weigh into this, both the federal courts and the state Supreme Court, and the role that they're going to have with regard to the redistricting and the maps that are ultimately drawn, probably in late 2021 or could be mid 2021, and then passed by the Republican legislature. The final thing I'll say is that barring something unforeseen, I think it's probably safe to assume that the Republicans will maintain solid control of both houses of the legislature following this November election. The reason I say that is because, as you know, in 2018, Democrats won all of the statewide offices, all the constitutional offices, governor, attorney general, treasurer, and yet not a single member of the Wisconsin legislature lost an election because even though Democrats received many more votes for the Wisconsin legislature than did Republicans, and that was because of the gerrymandering that the Republicans put in place in 2011. And as you may know too, the 2011 process that put the Republicans in control was the most partisan gerrymander of any state in the country in 2011, and it has worked like a charm for them. It has done exactly what they had hoped it would do. It has kept them firmly in control throughout this entire decade. And we anticipate that Robin Vos and whoever the new Republican Senate Majority Leader is that will replace Scott Fitzgerald is likely to try to do the exact same thing in 2021. But there are things that we can do to counter that. So with that, I want to stop and open it up to you because I think you all probably knew a lot of what I was talking about already, but I want to take your questions and comments and anything else that you want to say. And also, I need a drink of water. So,
and do you want to kick it off with your question in the notes?
I have a question. I'm curious about why there are a few Republican legislators who are willing to go against Vos and Fitzgerald and support fair maps, when I know that the legislators in this area are scared totally to go against leadership. So what kind of pressure are Vos and Fitzgerald putting on these people, and how are these 5 men brave enough to go against the dictates of Madison leadership?
You know, it's an excellent question, and I want to be very frank with you because I don't, I would love to tell you that because they are in good conscience thinking that this is the right thing to do. You know, I mean, I've worked with politicians all my life, and there's a cynical calculation involved with many of them about how they can do this. Now, in part, it's because a number of the individuals that have voiced support for the Iowa model are in areas where there is strong support for it amongst their constituents. So they felt a great deal of constituent pressure. It's also true that a number of these legislators are in the very few districts remaining in Wisconsin that are even remotely competitive. You probably know this. 9 out of 10, there are 99 assembly districts, 33 Senate districts in Wisconsin. 9 out of 10, 90%, roughly 90 are totally safe districts for either Republicans or Democrats in Wisconsin. Only about 10 are in play at all. And when I say in play, I'm saying competitive within 10 points. Even a 55 to 45% victory by a legislator is a landslide. But for the purposes of defining what competitiveness is, every legislative election in Wisconsin, 90% of them fall outside of that 55-45. So they're greater than that. Republicans win by greater margins than 55% in the districts that they have, and Democrats win by 55% in the ones they have. Democrats have been packed into fewer districts, so there are actually safer districts for Democrats, but Republicans have more districts in which they're spread out but still have an advantage because of the way the lines have been drawn. And they have the other advantages of having things like more money, because they've eliminated spending limits in Wisconsin and disclosure. And then, of course, voter suppression tactics that have been in place since 2011 favor Republicans. The voter ID bill, many of the voter purge issues, all of those are designed to favor Republicans. So those things have all acted to keep the Republicans in control. But to answer your question, the ones that do support nonpartisan redistricting reform, you can be sure that they have had discussions with Robin Vos and have said to Vos, we need to show support for this legislation. And Vos has said, okay, you can. So there is that cynical allowance of allowing some of these folks to be able to do that. You know, otherwise they wouldn't. Vos and Fitzgerald have been death on this. It's the thing they guard more jealously than anything else, is the ability to be able to control the redistricting process, because it is the source of all of their power. So they've given people like Oldenburg and Travis Tranel and Joel Kitchens kind of a pass on this. Okay, you can support it, you can co-sponsor it, but just don't be too enthusiastic about it. So that's really the reason, to be honest with you. And for me to say that it's because, you know, they're doing the right thing. Now, there were a number of Republicans who used to do the right thing. Guys like Dale Schultz, he's out of the legislature. Michael Ellis, the former Republican leader from Neenah, who I worked with for years on campaign finance reform. There are a number of other moderate Republicans. They've all been driven out of the party because of gerrymandering, frankly. And so the moderates, the people, Sheila Harsdorf, surprisingly, was at one time very good on this issue. She was a co-sponsor of the Iowa model legislation. But what happened to Sheila, of course, was that when the Republicans gained control in 2010 or 2011, she went over to the other side because Fitzgerald and the Republicans made it very clear that there wasn't going to be any dissent from the leadership on issues like this, on issues like voter suppression, redistricting, campaign finance. All of those things were very important to the Republican leaders so that they could exercise absolute control over the political process in Wisconsin. So Sheila went from somebody who was someone I used to work with and whose office I used to go to all the time to turning on me. Luther Olson, another person. There were a number, Alberta Darling in the Milwaukee area used to be supportive. All of these people basically gave up their support for good government types of issues like redistricting reform or open voting or campaign finance reform in return for a share of the power that was being doled out by the legislative leadership. I'm sorry, that was a long answer, but I just want you to know that's what's at play here.
Well, in your introduction, Jay, you mentioned that with grassroots organizing, we'd have a good chance, but that there'd be some landmines. Do you want to define the landmines?
Sure. The landmines I guess what I'm talking about is, I think as we go forward and we begin to pass these referendums this fall in the various counties, that's going to add more public support and add more pressure going into next year on Republicans in the legislature. And I think there'll be more Republican legislators who are going to feel the need to go to Robin Vos and the new Senate Majority Leader in the state Senate and say, we have got to demonstrate support for a nonpartisan system. And so those things will be useful. And I think we will pick up more support next year. Now, the Republican leadership, of course, is going to try to make sure that they maintain just enough support for their own position to not allow, a map to pass that would be anything that would be very advantageous to them. I mean, their whole rationale or their whole strategy is to try to make sure they can pass partisan maps in 2021 so that they can have firm control for the next 10 years, just as they've had for the last 10 years. But some of the other things that we anticipate that they're going to do is one of the things that's a little different this time than in 2011 is the fact that we have a Democratic governor as opposed to a Republican governor in 2011. So obviously when the Republicans rammed through the maps in 2011, Scott Walker was more than happy to sign the maps into law. That would not be the case if the Republican legislature passes the maps in 2021. Tony Evers will still be governor. He would veto the Republican maps, which means that if those maps are vetoed, the only way the Republicans could pass them would be to have a 2/3 majority override of the governor's veto. And they do not yet have 2/3 of the votes in the Wisconsin legislature of either house. There's some speculation that they could get it in this election, although I don't really see that happening, but they could try to. So, but the way that they could do this is they could do something that they did after the 1960 redistricting process, and that is try to pass the gerrymandered maps, the Republican maps, through something that's called a joint resolution. And a joint resolution is not subject to a gubernatorial veto. In other words, they could pass the maps by a vehicle known as a joint resolution as opposed to a regular piece of legislation. And the governor does not have the power to veto a joint resolution. And therefore, the maps would then be passed and put into place because the governor doesn't have the ability to veto them. Now, when that was last tried in 1962, there was a Democratic governor, John Reynolds, and a Republican legislature. The Republicans rammed through their maps with a joint resolution, and the governor wasn't able to veto them. The Wisconsin Supreme Court at that time said that's unconstitutional. The governor has a role in the redistricting process. We have a different Supreme Court now. As you know, we have a Wisconsin Supreme Court that is not at all reluctant to go against precedent and act in a very partisan manner. It was the Wisconsin Supreme Court, after all, that overthrew the John Doe investigation of Governor Scott Walker in 2012 when he was being investigated for a violation of campaign finance laws. The Wisconsin Supreme Court stepped in and said, we think that's fine. The governor can coordinate his campaign activities. There's reason to believe that the Wisconsin Supreme Court, with its current majority, would weigh in on the side of the Republicans and say that a joint resolution is okay, and that the legislature should have the power to be able to pass their maps, and that the governor may not have the ability to veto them. We don't know for sure that that's what would happen, but there's a pretty good, the Republicans are betting that that's the case. The reason we know that is that a Republican conservative law firm called the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, which is based in Milwaukee. It's run by a guy called Rick Essenberg. You can look this up, W-I-L-L. You should Google it. They are a very strong law firm that is funded by the Bradley Foundation, by the Koch brothers, by a number of very conservative foundations. And the whole thing that they are trying to do is make sure that Republicans and conservatives are able to control the levers of political power. WILL is the same organization that is behind the voter purge of 200,000 people on the current Wisconsin voter list, which has fortunately been stalled until after the election. But that was the group that weighed in last year in Ozaukee County and had a judge order the Wisconsin Elections Commission to begin immediately to purge anybody that hadn't returned a postcard that was sent out by the Wisconsin Elections Commission, because WILL, this organization, alleged that they were not at their current address and therefore should be purged from the list. And that's not the way the law works. You can't purge somebody immediately because they don't return a postcard. that was sent in the mail. So what I'm telling you is that they are strategically looking to 2021 and 2022 to utilize the state Supreme Court as the vehicle by which they can ram through their maps and not have them subject to a gubernatorial veto. And the other reason that you should know why that is very possible is because last July, the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts, ruled that the federal courts were not going to intervene in partisan gerrymandering cases anymore. The Wisconsin case that was before the United States Supreme Court was dismissed when the US Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the federal courts will only weigh in if there's a violation of the voting rights law, but they're not going to weigh in if it's a partisan matter. They said, this is the Roberts Court, 5-4, said that the state courts will be the ones who will adjudicate these matters. And so in Wisconsin, as you know, 4-3 conservative majority, which will be in place at least until 2023, because there's no Supreme Court election in Wisconsin until 2023 again. We just had one this year, as you know. There's no Supreme Court election in 2021 or 2022. So the conservatives will have a solid 4-3 majority through the redistricting process.
So what's the recourse if that's the case?
There would be lawsuits, but it would be very tough, because if the Wisconsin Supreme Court is the last court of jurisdiction, and if the federal courts refuse to take it because they would argue that it's a partisan matter, then the matter would be finalized by a ruling of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And if the Wisconsin Supreme Court, said a joint resolution is okay, that would freeze the governor out. If the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, well, okay, no, the governor can weigh in, but we're going to look at the maps that have been drawn by the Republicans, and then we'll decide what the maps are. Well, they have a conservative majority of 4-3. And so if the Wisconsin Supreme Court decided to draw the maps, then you would have that conservative majority deciding what the state legislative and congressional districts would look like. So right now it looks grim.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm a little too optimistic about this, but I think that maybe is another good reason for grassroots organizations and these referendums to be really strong, because I know the court won't necessarily be swayed by the people of Wisconsin, but the court could be swayed if it's really clear that all the people of Wisconsin want one thing. It makes it a lot more difficult for a court to throw something like that out. Would you agree?
I do agree, and I do agree. The court, actually, they say they're not subject to outside pressure, but they are, and they do read the poll results. They looked at the Marquette poll. They know full well, as does everybody, as do the Republicans, that Republican voters support nonpartisan redistricting. 62%, as you know, you've seen those figures. And overwhelmingly, the people of Wisconsin support it. So they get that. And in 2023, they will be up for election. The Chief Justice, Rogensack, my guess is she will not run again, but she'll be in her early 80s. But that seat, it will be the swing seat. It'll be the seat that is in play in 2023. And let us suppose that the Wisconsin Supreme Court acted in a very partisan manner and voted to uphold the Republican maps strictly because they could, and also froze the governor out by mistakenly and I think unconstitutionally ruling in favor of a joint resolution way to do that. Well, that would put their majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court in danger in 2023, unquestionably. And that would be a huge campaign issue. So you're right, there is enormous incentive for citizens, I think, to act even in a stronger manner. Also, it's more important than ever that you do this to put pressure on your legislators. Because, if you can get enough Republicans feeling uncomfortable about this, then there's nothing to say that more and more of them might just say to Robin Voss, sorry, Robin, we can't be with you on this. We have to listen to our constituents. So that's why the grassroots pressure is enormously important. Absolutely. But I don't want you to be under any illusions about what's ahead. I mean, this is a situation ahead that is not all sunshine.
Right.
So there's lots of stuff ahead of us. I'm not trying to discourage anybody, but I just think it's important for you people who work on this issue to have a really, eyes open, sober view of what's ahead of us here.
Yeah, thank you. Anne Marie, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question about the People's Map Commission that the governor's put together. Do you think that that's going to have much of an influence on the legislative body, other than annoy them?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. So since we've been able to get the Iowa model legislation introduced, beginning in 2013, we have been unable to get a public hearing in the Wisconsin legislature. We've had some alternative public hearings. Senator Dale Schultz and Senator Tim Cullen, as you know, have been traveling around the state. Tim Cullen, by the way, is the co-chair of Common Cause. He is the chair of our state governing board, and he and Tim and Dale Schultz, who was the Republican state senator, as you know, very strongly in favor of Iowa. They did hold, when they were in the Wisconsin legislature, we held a couple of alternative public hearings. They weren't sanctioned by the Republicans who were in control of the legislature. They were still held. But the People's Commission called for by the governor is the first opportunity to have really a statewide public hearing on the issue, in which citizens in every congressional district are going to be able to weigh in. And that is important because a lot of the work that's been done up to now, a lot of people don't know about because there haven't been public hearings about it, and the Republicans have done a good job of trying to keep this secret. Now, as you know, these hearings are all virtual. They're all going to be by Zoom. That's not as strong as, say, an in-person public hearing that would be held in each of the congressional districts. But the good thing is that I think the press will cover these, and the media will cover these because they'll be something that'll be very interesting. They begin in September, and there's one every month for the next 9 months, the next 8 months throughout the 8 congressional districts in Wisconsin. And my guess is that the ones particularly right after the election will get a great deal of coverage, and the press will cover those, and that will educate a lot more people. So I think it's really important that you all, as sort of leaders in this issue, weigh in on these public hearings. It's not clear to me yet whether or not you're in the 3rd congressional district. You're in Ron Kind's district. Is that right?
And I think 7th also, our
7th,
project.
Okay, so there's both. So it's Tiffany and Kind, both gerrymandered districts, both districts which used to be competitive, by the way. Prior to 2011, we had 5 competitive congressional districts. Now we have 0. There's not a single one is competitive. And you know what happened to the 7th and the 3rd? The 7th was gerrymandered to be safe for the Republicans, and the 3rd was gerrymandered to be safe for Ron Kind. And so neither of them are really competitive. Excuse me. So wait, let me just turn this off here. Sorry about that. I have a very noisy phone. Sorry about that. So what was I saying? Senator Schultz and Senator Cullen. So they are going to testify at a number of these hearings. I think you can weigh in not just in the 3rd and in the 7th, although it would be important that you weigh in at both of those. But the fact that they're virtual means that I think citizens from all over the state are going to be able to participate in all of these public hearings. And that's a good thing. So yes, they're a good thing. Absolutely.
Are there arguments Republicans make against the Iowa model, or do they just skirt the issue?
No, they do. Well, I don't know if you had an opportunity to read. Janelle did send around an op-ed that I had written earlier.
Yes, I did read that, yeah.
And so one of the things that they like to say about Iowa is that it's unconstitutional because the legislature has to draw the maps, and you're having the Legislative Reference Bureau in Wisconsin draw the maps. Well, that's untrue. What happens, as in Iowa and in Wisconsin, is that the legislature has to finalize the maps, they have to pass the maps, but it's silent. Wisconsin is silent about who actually draws the maps. So in Wisconsin, in the Iowa model legislation, the Legislative Reference Bureau actually does the drawing of the maps. And what Republicans like to say is that that's not possible because the legislature has to draw them. No, that's not true. The Constitution and the law is silent on who actually has to draw them. And we have a memo from the Legislative Council, which are the attorneys for the legislature, saying the Iowa model legislation, Assembly Bill 303, Senate Bill 288, are perfectly constitutional because the passage of the maps is still left up to the Wisconsin legislature. And that's what the Constitution requires. So that's the first thing they say. The second thing they like to say is that, oh, you don't want to have bureaucrats who are unelected and unaccountable drawing the maps. Legislators should be the people because we're accountable. Oh, really? You're accountable when you have an utterly safe seat? You're accountable when you are in a seat in which you cannot be defeated? There's nothing accountable about having a totally safe seat. That's the whole problem with gerrymandering.
And they bring in their own specialists anyway, right? They bring in very partisan hacks pretty much, don't they?
Absolutely, and often from out of state. The people that drew the map, their chief expert in 2011 was a guy from Oklahoma that they brought in to draw the most partisan possible maps that could be drawn. That's right. So the way the process worked in 2011 is that the maps were drawn in a law firm across the street from the Capitol. Michael Best and Friedrich is the name of the law firm. And in that law firm, the maps were drawn by aides to Voss and Fitzgerald, to the leaders, with the lawyers from Michael Best and Friedrich. And they were all drawn entirely in secret. They were all drawn without input at all from the public. And the process cost Wisconsin taxpayers about $4 million for the Republicans not only to draw the maps, but to defend the maps over the many suits that occurred as a result of those, as a result of that process in 2011. So that's absolutely right. It was done by a lot of out-of-state experts that were brought in to make the maps. And by the way, the one thing you should know is that of all the maps drawn by any legislature in the country in 2011, the maps drawn by the Wisconsin legislature, the Republicans in Wisconsin, were the most partisan of any state in the country. And they were amongst the 5 most partisan maps drawn by either political party in the last 50 years in the country. So that was a process, and that's why they've worked so well. That's why nobody ever loses elections in Wisconsin at either the congressional level or at the state legislative level, because these districts are locked in. Exactly.
One of the arguments that a current incumbent in, I think, the 28th district used, Gabe Magnifici, she said, in this day and age, there is no such thing as a nonpartisan committee.
So here's the answer to that question. The Legislative Reference Bureau that is charged with drawing the maps is basically the same thing as the Legislative Service Bureau in Iowa. Now, in Iowa, yes, they're bureaucrats, but it's not left to their whim and their decision about how the maps are drawn. They have to abide by a strict criteria of nonpartisanship. Some of those things that I mentioned before. So the people that draw the maps they don't sit in a room and say, oh, I'm pretty nonpartisan. I guess here's how I think we should draw the maps. No, they have to, the criteria that they have to abide by is that they can't use past election results when they're drawing the maps. They have to keep counties together to the extent possible. They have to keep cities together to the extent possible. In Wisconsin, 48 of the 72 counties in Wisconsin are divided and put into different legislative districts for purely partisan reasons. There are small cities in Wisconsin that are divided. Cities like Beloit, which is about 30,000 people, or Sheboygan, which is about 40,000. Some of these cities are divided into as many as 3 assembly districts, simply in order to achieve a partisan goal drawn by the Republicans in 2011. You can't do that in Iowa, and the Legislative Reference Bureau wouldn't be able to do anything like that because it's the criteria that they have to abide by. So when someone says, oh, you know, there's no such thing as a nonpartisan person, well, that doesn't matter, and that because it's not the person who's making the decision, it's the criteria by which they have to abide by. The key to that, I think, is that you cannot use past election results when you draw the maps. And think about it, if you did, and there are Democrats, by the way, that would love to do this, and I know some of them, and you know, and my board and I have we've been in screaming arguments with them because they want to be able to partisan gerrymander Wisconsin just like the Republicans did in 2011. They want revenge. That would defeat the whole purpose of this exercise. If you allow partisanship and allow past election results to be used to draw the maps, you might as well just say, well, we're never going to solve this problem. Right. So that's the answer. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally. Thank you. That's
criteria. It's the
criteria. Yeah. Linda, do you have a question too?
Yeah. Well, I did have a question in the chat, but I just wanted to also ask, I know that Iowa's constitution, I believe, has a provision that does not allow for partisan preferences in their redistricting process, nor favoring incumbents. Wisconsin does not have such a provision. So I wonder what kind of influence that has on their redistricting process, which we would not have. Well, and also, if you know who will be sponsoring the Iowa model legislation in the upcoming legislative session.
Okay, with regard to the first question, the Iowa, so first of all, I don't know that it's in the Constitution. I think it's in the criteria that is required by the Legislative Service Bureau in Iowa that prohibits the consideration of the hometown, in other words, the residents, and then also prohibits the use of the election results, which is the past performance, the political performance. So that's written into the actual criteria that the Legislative Service Bureau draws in Iowa. And that's why we can do the same thing in Wisconsin. It's written in the legislation that you abide by the criteria, basically the Iowa criteria, when you're drawing the maps. So that eliminates the problem of residents trying to protect the hometown of the legislator or the member of Congress, which is why the joke in Iowa is that the best season for moving companies in Iowa is every 10 years when redistricting occurs, because legislators have to move to different districts in order to stay in their district, because the Legislative Service Bureau has drawn the maps without any consideration of where they live. But again, the past political performance is really the key. And again, it's something that we're probably going to have a battle with some of the more partisan folks involved in the redistricting process in Wisconsin, because there are a number of those folks that want to be able to use past election results. And here's the key, that something that all of you should understand. You know, Iowa does not determine and mandate that elections be competitive. In order to do that, you would have to actually look at past election results. You would have to sort of look at the past election results in every legislative district. And if you wanted to make them non-competitive, you would have to do that. You'd have to draw the maps in such a way that you would make sure that they were all very close. Now that would run in the face of doing things like keeping counties together and keeping communities of interest together. It just so happens that as a result of the way they do it in Iowa with this nonpartisan criteria, elections do happen to be more competitive than they are in Wisconsin, but it's not mandated by the criteria that is used to draw the maps. And I think if you can understand, and that's a subtle difference, because if you are mandating competitiveness, you are preordaining a result that you want. And the only way you can preordain a result that you want is if you use the past election results in that legislative district to draw the maps in such a way that you would get that result. And that's not what we want to do. We don't want to have a system. We want to have a system that makes sense. Now, what does that mean? That means in Wisconsin, there are always going to be certain areas that are always going to be very Republican. The assembly district that I live in the near east side of Madison. It's the Isthmus, if you know what that is. It is probably the most Democratic district in the state of Wisconsin. I think Romney in 2012 got maybe 2% of the vote in my district. And then those people that did vote for him, they were hunted down and exiled. I'm kidding. I'm just saying that there are certain districts that are always going to be very Democratic. And there are certain districts in Wisconsin that are always going to be heavily Republican. But there are many other districts where they can be drawn in such a way that you're not gerrymandering them, you're not dividing them, and there would be many more competitive elections. And the proof of that is how the Republicans gained control of the Wisconsin legislature in 2010. Democrats, as you recall, in 2010, held both houses of the Wisconsin legislature and the governorship. In 2010, it was kind of a Republican wave year around the country. The only reason the Republicans captured control of the Wisconsin legislature is there were enough competitive districts in Wisconsin for that to happen. They weren't all gerrymandered. So that's what made it possible. And so wave elections are still going to happen, but wave elections in Wisconsin are meaningless. There was a wave election in 2018. The Democrats captured 53% of the votes statewide and have only 36% of the state legislative seats. So that's a long answer to your question. Sorry. I get wound up.
Yeah, that's good. So Linda had a question about who the sponsors will be, and then I don't know, I only scheduled this for an hour. I probably need to jump off pretty quickly. I don't know where other people are at, but if there's one other pressing question, maybe
yeah.
we could take it. And
I'm happy to stay on if people want to. That's fine.
okay, but maybe we first address that. Do you know who the sponsors are? Yeah.
Well, the sponsors in the current legislature were Senator David Hansen, who's retiring. He's a Green Bay Democrat. So it'll be someone else. We don't know yet who it's going to be. So that'll be next year. And then in the assembly, it's typically the freshman Democrats who come in. So again, those will be new Democrats who are elected. So again, we don't have the names of the sponsors. Hopefully we'll maybe have a Republican or two that will be lead sponsors of this when it's introduced in early 2021. We're certainly going to work on that. And that would be great if we can, because that would make it truly bipartisan at introduction, which would be enormously helpful.
Thank you so much. Are there any other, maybe one last question if anyone has one, or do we feel like we've absorbed enough information in this last hour? I certainly have. It's very helpful.
I have a question. In the reading I've done, the Iowa model is often held up as a very fair, equitable model. Although, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is Iowa the only state that has actually been able to use it? Somehow in other states, I imagine there's constitutional differences, but is there also just a stickiness to the process that prevents other states from actually following the Iowa model, even if they're following parts of it?
To date, Iowa is the only state that has the Iowa model. Reformers, my counterparts in North Carolina, are working on trying to pass Iowa model legislation in North Carolina. There are a number of other states that also have in their sort of bill drafts the model of Iowa. And again, the reason that you would look to Iowa is because those would be states like Wisconsin, like North Carolina, that require the maps to ultimately be passed, even if it's just by an up or down vote by the legislature. So states that have an initiative and referendum process, Michigan, for instance, was able to bypass the Michigan legislature last year, and they have the ability to be able to have redistricting reform because they could bypass the legislature. We just can't do that. And just so you understand, what it would require in Wisconsin to bypass the legislature would be to amend the Wisconsin Constitution, which requires that you have to go through 2 sessions of the Wisconsin legislature with enabling legislation to eliminate the legislature as the factor in drawing the maps. And of course, that's not likely to happen ever, that they would want to give up that power. So no, the short answer is yes, only Iowa, but there are plenty of other states that are wanting to do Iowa.
Thank you.
I don't know, Lorene, did you have any questions, or Sarah or Peg? I want to make sure you get it in if you have one.
So my questions, somebody already asked and they were answered, so I'm good. Thank
Okay,
you.
great.
And I'd like to say this has been really wonderful because I need to be talking to a lot of people at the farmers market. So now I have a lot of good information to give them. Thank
Well,
you very much.
Great.
Well, thank you.